समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
How many times since the Davos conference this year in January have you heard the term middle powers? I'm sure more times than you can remember. In fact, I heard a colleague chuckle during a coffee break at my third conference on middle powers recently. You know what he said? Isn't middle power a bit like saying slightly pregnant? Sounds funny, but it was a fair question. What exactly is the sudden fixation? More importantly, what does the phrase even mean? Is it a measure of economic size, military capability, population, a country's willingness to keep its options open, or is it merely a polite way of describing states that matter enough to be invited to the table but not enough to decide the menu? Lately, middle power has acquired the remarkable ability to mean almost anything. Then there is the question of agency. Is a middle power something a country calls itself or something others call it? Now, India is perhaps a good example of this ambiguity. Much of the global strategic community happily describes India as a middle power. India, on the other hand, seems rather unhappy with that label. Now, depending on who one listens to, India could be a rising power, a leading power, a pivotal power, or an emerging great power. The semantics could change, but ground realities do not. Everybody seems convinced that being in the middle is suddenly where history is unfolding. The more one listens to disarrayed discussions on middle powers, the more one is reminded of the Steelers' Wheel song. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. To begin with, let's revisit Davos briefly. You know, the renewed engagement owes much to Canadian PM Mark Carney's speech at Davos earlier this year. A Canadian colleague later told me that Carney had been preparing the speech for nearly a year, though its timing was as crucial as its content. From Perika's shocks to allies and partners, deepening militarization and growing uncertainty about the intent and durability of America's security commitments resonated widely across the board. For the record, middle power is highly a novel concept. The term acquired prominence during the 1970s and 1980s to describe countries such as Canada, Australia, Sweden, and Norway, states that were neither superpowers nor insignificant actors, but countries capable of exercising influence through diplomacy and institution building. Over time, the club expanded to include countries as diverse as South Korea, Indonesia, Turkey, and Mexico. Different scholars produced different criteria, but the key is that middle powers has not been a static concept or a category. It has always reflected the anxieties of a particular international order, and generations have rediscovered the term for their own reasons. Today, in addition to Trump's turbulence, we also live in an era where almost everything has become weaponized. Energy supplies, rare earths, shipping lanes, financial systems, data, semiconductors, insurance markets, and even logistics. As Hervé Delphin, the EU envoy to India, recently remarked, we find ourselves in a peculiar paradox where the need for cooperation has never been greater, yet the willingness to cooperate is at an all time low. And why is that? Because of a looming trust deficit. Now, from this reasonable lens, most middle power engagement is trying to then de risk from perpetual global uncertainty. And it is here, I think, that the conversation on middle powers begins to get productive. Now, while several issues could be highlighted where middle power engagement could deliver a net positive, but I want to focus on the lessons from the two recent wars in Ukraine and in Gulf, and on the deepening middle power defense synergy. So, this is the era of war and cost effective weapons to fight that war. You know, for decades, military superiority appeared almost synonymous with technological superiority and the ability to impose what scholars refer to as technological lock-ins. The US epitomizes an ecosystem of high-end platforms, exquisite engineering, and unmatched power projection, and remains the most advanced military superpower of our times. Russia built its own formidable military industrial base as number two. However, the current wars have complicated and transformed the inferences drawn from military superiority alone. The Russia Ukraine war became a live laboratory of the fastest mil-tech innovation anywhere in the world. The Iran war confirmed that expensive and advanced platforms would struggle against 21st century warfighting techniques based on inexpensive swarms of drones and missiles. Attrition, fast feedback loops, and cost benefit industrial resilience emerged as the main strategic variables. Possessing the most advanced weapon cannot give strategic victory, as wars quickly turn asymmetric. Increasingly, outcome depends on how quickly one can adapt to grinding wars of attrition in the most cost effective manner. And this is where a less discussed aspect begins to emerge. Great powers continue to dominate frontier defense technologies with the world's finest fighter aircraft, missile systems, stealth capabilities, and networks. Yet, these technologies come embedded within tightly controlled ecosystems where source codes, for instance, remain inaccessible and software upgrades require approval. Weapon usage, in fact, also remains tied to political conditions. Even among treaty allies, unresolved questions on industrial sovereignty recently resulted in Europe's Future Combat Air System program collapsing. What I just described is the defense tech model built on what experts are now referring to as technological lock-ins. Alongside, however, another model is taking shape, which is more fluid with cross-cutting defense value chains more cost-effectively. Take a look at these examples. Countries such as Turkey, UAE, and in other ways, China and Pakistan have begun developing defense ecosystems that are considerably more modular. They, especially China, are not attempting to outcompete the US in producing the world's most sophisticated combat aircraft only. Instead, they are creating systems that are easier to localize, customize, integrate, battle test, and also sell. The Pakistani Chinese JF-17 is perhaps the most familiar example. Not having any spectacular lead, it can incorporate different engines, radars, and payloads sourced from multiple countries as the customer requires. The objective is not technological perfection, but flexibility. It can be tailored to operational needs without requiring complete dependence on a single supplier at a fraction of cost. The point here is not to dismiss or exaggerate it. The point is to analyze the dynamic. Let me give another example. Much has already been written about drones being inexpensive and crucial to today's wars. That observation, while true, still doesn't talk enough about subsystems integration in drone warfare. Drones matter because they multiply combinations. Sensors, communication systems, surveillance, EW suits or electronic warfare, and payloads can all be altered with remarkable speed based on feedback from the battlefield. Turkish defense firms have developed a remarkable ability to integrate subsystems rapidly while constantly incorporating lessons from active battlefronts. For instance, in November last year, which is quite recently, Turkey became the first country in the world to successfully battle test Göktuğ Beyond Visual Range BVR air-to-air missile launched from the Bayraktar Kızılelmak uncrewed drone. This path-breaking event took place off the coast of Sinop over the Black Sea in the Ukraine war. Now, if this eventually transforms the BVR air combat is not the point right now. BVR missiles launched from drones are now moving from concept towards operational reality. As detection networks become increasingly integrated through airborne early warning systems, satellites, and AI-enabled targeting, air forces may eventually find themselves reconsidering how far to risk several millions dollars fighter aircraft where far cheaper autonomous systems can perform at least some part of that mission. Why it also matters is the speed with which this doctrinal experimentation is occurring in India's backyard. Turkey and Pakistan have been working to merge their missile technologies, especially the long-range air-to-air missiles, to be deployed on J-17 Block 3s and potentially J-10Cs. Now remember that China's PL-15 against India during Op Sindoor on the first night of the offensive was another part of the same defense synergy. Let's move our gaze further. Equally interesting is the growing cooperation between Turkey's defense industry and the UAE's Edge Group. On the surface, such collaboration appears counterintuitive. Why? Because Turkey has gotten closer to Saudi Arabia, while UAE has moved closer to Israel. And yet, their defense industrial cooperation has expanded through joint integration of payloads, sensors, and operational expertise. The Edge Group routinely tests a variety of Emirati payloads on Turkish drones because of a high degree of technical integration, which is only growing. The objective is the same: less about creating a single revolutionary platform and more about developing interoperable capabilities capable of evolving quickly with battle-tested feedback. Now, it is also important to note that these countries are not abandoning the quest for indigenous capabilities, but they are also localizing their comparative advantage. Instead of insisting on producing or assembling domestically, they are localizing what they can, integrating what they cannot, and building resilient supply chains across multiple partners. Competitive advantage replaces complete self sufficiency, and that is why this middle power engagement is more fluid than what meets the eye. This is one of the issues where I believe today's middle power conversation deserves greater attention in a militarizing world. Much of this activity receives lesser attention because it lacks the theatre of superpower competition, and yet it may prove equally consequential, if not more. None of this suggests that modular integrated systems will outdo cutting edge military technologies tomorrow. But recent wars have demonstrated that technological sophistication alone does not translate into strategic success. Perhaps that is also the real reason hidden beneath today's enthusiasm for middle powers, where the easier part of the discussion is on the rhetorical speeches on the failure of multilateralism and unending interpretations of the world order. The harder part, though, concerns expert analysis on specific issues where pathways for middle power engagement starts to differ and inferences drawn have immediate implications. Needless to say, it has several ponderables for India, but that's another story for another day. One parting word of caution, though. International politics has hardly suffered from a shortage of semantics, but mostly from shortage of clarity. The issue-centric discussion must remain central to enthusiasm around middle power discourse. Otherwise, it risks suffering the same fate as another global south that everyone loves to invoke, but none really can define. I'll be back to discuss more on the cross-cutting defense energy of middle powers and implications for India, so you stay tuned.